So just coming back then to the meta-narratives thing, how can a meta-narrative, which by definition, right, is a narrative that includes all narratives, how can that remain grounded in humanity? Maybe that's not a bad question. How can a meta-narrative retain its humanity?
For me, what's coming up is the simultaneous being a member of the whole as well as the individual. And right now, studying, learning from the Enneagram and the importance of not even the 9 types, but really like the 27, like the billions of types, because everyone brings their own flavor to it, even if we do have these unique 9 human variations. That we hold, but like I was saying in the beginning before we started recording, that like parental role is the closest one I can think of where there's a positive to that authoritarian role. And at the same time, we still don't look at our children as individual entities that are here to express their own journey and their own like sole purpose. We're supposed to mold them and shape them. And there's something in that, the meta narrative of like, are human beings a canvas on which we paint as parents and society, or are they a sculpture in marble, right, waiting to be chipped away at, I guess? And either way, it's still we're enacting on them. But is there a process that unfolds? How much do we need to craft it as society, and how much is it an allowance and a flow? And that's what I was watching right before this. Is someone posted a game B a video on Tao, the Tao, and that flow is what's coming up for me right now. Allowing that flow in the universe and allowing it in one another, because that's where most of our conflict comes up. And the need to control is that I know your flow better than you do. You're doing it wrong, whether it's as a parent or another human being on the planet. Like, do it the way I think you should do it instead of allowing for that unfolding of the Tao.
But then we do need guidance to help us to find our flow, right? I mean, I'm thinking about learning a musical instrument, for example. Before you can express your deepest being through your music, you have to enslave yourself, if you like, to the practicing of the discipline of music. Before you can have the freedom of expression, you first have to submit to the discipline, right? So that there is the analogy of parenting is a good one, right? Because at the beginning, the parenting is completely authoritarian, right? The baby has no agency, choice-making capacity, able to act on their choices, even if they could make them, right? So the parent is completely authoritarian. But, and I come back to this idea of humanity, I mean, at least for most parents, right? The humanity of their child is central. Yes, they're controlling every aspect of that child's life, but it is absolutely and genuinely in service to that child. The stuff you were saying about crafting it so that it's a good reflection of me as a parent, yeah, that's a part of it. But even that is done with the idea, with at least the excuse of it being in service to the child, right? So my point is that it's not authoritarian or totalitarian in the way that we've been talking about it here, because the parents care about what the outcome is for the child, right? Whereas the totalitarian regime cares not a jot about the individual outcomes of its people, right? Only of the structure.
I think it's a little too simplistic, Eric, because there's misguided intention. A parent may well have the best of intentions for their child, but the imposition of what the parents' will or agenda on the process of development goes completely awry. And you know, my concern is that the socialization of the history of meta narratives has been doing that in terms of conditioning a populace and the young people of the populace to basically take their autonomy from them. That the imposition of the meta-narrative is to control, and to control for the benefit of the purveyors of the meta-narrative. Now that's a hypothesis that really, I think, takes a pretty astute examination of history. But those are kind of the areas that I'm working in with respect to kind of the underlying purpose, and I've touched upon the
Yeah, the bad internet connection you warned us about has just reared its head, Brian. We lost you there for a little while.
Who benefit? Okay, yeah.
Maybe turn your camera off while you're talking. That sometimes improves the audio connection. If you turn the video off while you're talking. Oh, he's gone again. Yeah, I don't know if you can hear us, Brian, but you're frozen to us and we can't hear you. I mean, from what I got from what Brian was saying was something along the lines of bad parenting can happen despite the best of intentions, right? Like good intentions alone are not enough. And I think of course that is absolutely right. But the parent who cares about their child, if they're doing something wrong and it's pointed out to them, might endeavor to change their bad habits into better habits. Whereas the totalitarian regime that cares not about its people doesn't want to have its mistakes pointed out. As far as it's concerned, it's not making mistakes, right? It's doing exactly what it wants. So there is a distinction there.
Interesting, because having one child, it's the worst scientific experiment ever, right? Like you don't know what you're doing that's actually impacting them versus not, right? Like how much is luck of the draw, and they would be this way no matter what you do, and how much is that shaping. Whereas when you have multiple children and theoretically you parent them all the same, even though that's nearly impossible, as they don't come all at once, they're not a litter of kittens, they're not they, you know, and you grow even if you had one every year, you would grow in between that time period. But that one set of parents can raise completely different children, even with that love and guidance. And then you can kind of be like, well, I'm a good or bad parent based on how many of them are good or bad human beings on the other end. But as a society, we don't do that. We put it all somewhat on if they're bad, it's on them. And if they're good, it's on society, right? Like we don't look at all of the mental health crisis and all of the people in prison and be like, wow, are we ever fucking up as a species or a society? It's like that person, that individual messed up. And even in families, we do that to some degree. You know, they had everything going for them and they ended up on the wrong side of society, or, you know, that there's still, I think the parenting analogy is still coming up for me, but that doesn't mean it has to come up for anyone else. That's just what I'm sitting with totalitarianism and where I experience it in my life, both as a child growing up and now as a parent.
Following on this line of investigation, has anybody ever done any research into commonalities in terms of the childhood experience of dictators, Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot? Is there anything they got in common that makes them turn out the way they do?
Only children?
Well, their childhood experience, you know, I mean, we've, you know, it's a fact in the UK that so many of the people that rise to the top went to public school, and, you know, that they were carted off to boarding schools as children. Mm-hmm. What sort of damage does it do that makes them turn out the way that they do? And then why do we succumb to them, the rest of us?
Boarding school, that's a really good question. I don't know, but I know that boarding school. It would be curious how many of them went to boarding school, because that's brilliant.
One of the things that's coming up from some of the work I've been doing has been a distinction between levels of development to the point of personality. I think Lena last week had, mentioned her disdain for identity politics, and I think this is the area of identity politics is personality, and how a public that's otherwise kind of under an illusion of sorts, how easily swayed and manipulated they are by persona, kind of, and that this is the psychology of that is one of identification, and in the collective dimensions, who do we identify with and why,
Yeah, that's good, Brian. It's got me thinking along an interesting line. I think that this is a personal thing, and I know this may only make sense to people that meditate regularly, but I wonder if like access to the meta narrative is not possible until this whole identity politics thing. This is like sticking labels on the self, small s self, right? And the small s self can have any number of labels stuck to it, but self big S, there are no labels which go on that, right? This is in the realm of the unspeakable, the Tao, the God, the unknowable, all of this kind of thing, and that a certain degree of detachment from self self small s, the recognition that self big S encompasses all possible selves small s, right? And that, the willingness to die by the identity that we attach to the little self, that all looks ridiculous in the face of familiarity with the big self, right? And so I just, and it sounds like, oh well, everyone has to learn how to meditate, and but maybe that is a prerequisite to detaching from the importance of identity. Maybe it is a prerequisite.
I just wanted to talk about also how our identity is also kind of created by our social programming, and how we're really influenced by our society. And most people in the US, for example, don't meditate. It's just a direct to what you were saying. Most people in the US don't meditate, and they're just very susceptible to what is outside of them. And that social programming is what kind of creates this rigid mentality, right? But then the only thing, in my opinion, that can break people out of that is meditation, looking inside, coupled with reading and educating yourself outside of the box. I think the way that our institutions, both public and private, especially in the United States, but honestly, more so British education, is really, really dangerous to the free thinker, and to, because we're assimilating. Everything is about assimilating and socialize. But I mean, to me, socializing is synonymous with assimilating into these totalitarian cultures and regimes. So travel, I think traveling outside of your home country and having other worldwide perspectives is really important, and kind of seeing reading on your own, radical research, but too many people don't go down that line, meaning just holding yourself accountable for the information that you take in, self-school, like schooling yourself, getting curious, right, with what's inside, and then allowing a space to work from that space versus from what you're told to. If someone mentions, for example, here, the Revolutionary War, look at the Native American side, despite not being told, and learn what they're saying, and then kind of compare and contrast and self-research. I have always tended to be a self-researcher, so it's kind of, I've noticed it's a very, very good way to keep the mind open and clear and in line with self, right? So with integrity and morals and self-morals. So that's kind of what came up for me.
I'm going to circle around back to you, Eric, if I can. I think I'll extend my critique first, although your framing wasn't perfect. That basically that's right. Consciousness, some sense of what consciousness is and how it works. I think involving the element of interiority, just from an experiential perspective with regard to the practitioner. But this is kind of what I'm seeing there. Again, I'm saying going back 100 years or thereabouts is where it gets tricky. And I think even the dialogue between us to this point is with regard to intent and how one cannot really assess 100% with regard to intent what the other either knows or doesn't know. And this is where the dialogue kind of between the prospect of vying for meta-narrative, the dominance of a meta-narrative. And kind of what I'm using as my example here is the work of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. The irony, Teilhard's premier work was The Phenomenon of Man. I just started working with that, but the introduction to that was a very verbose. It was a lengthy introduction by Sir Julian Huxley. And Sir Julian Huxley, even in the introduction, mentions the publication of his Modern Synthesis, the book on Modern Synthesis. That group had become the dominant scientific narrative from the point that The Phenomenon of Man was published posthumously with regard to Teilhard. Teilhard had passed away, and it was, the book was published after his death. That's a very, very intriguing kind of sequence with regard to, kind of as an example of inception of meta-narrative, let alone its development. So that's just shared a little tidbit of what I'm working with, and perhaps for the individual practitioner like myself, Does that knowledge somehow make me a target for censorship by Facebook? I mean, you know, and
apparently so.
well, I don't know. I mean, I really, one thing in my own learning experience is how to take the best qualified scientific approach and be really the best scientists, but not be constrained, quite frankly, by the rules necessarily of dominant science, right? Because I know I think their limitations are becoming, with the passing of time, increasingly obvious to us, you know, average, normal, everyday people, you know, who are practitioners in terms of doing the best that we know how in this process.
Well, the prevailing scientific wisdom, you know, the materialist, mechanistic sort of universe, doesn't take into account the interiority that you were talking about at the start, right? I think that's a good word. Interiority is a really good word to get at what we've been talking about. And any meta narrative that seeks to resist the advance of totalitarianism, or to be resilient against, the advance of totalitarianism, has to value that integration of interiority with the exterior, right? The exterior phenomena of the world, that's one thing, and science is great for measuring and categorizing and understanding all of that, fan-fucking-tastic. However, for understanding the interior of our world, we need different tools to that, right? And so the meta-narrative needs to expand beyond science and beyond what we currently understand as religion, right? Which is not really getting in touch with your interiority. It's outsourcing your interiority to some deity, right? To some deity or book or something like that, rather than a genuine exploration of your interior by you. It's farmed that. What's the word I'm looking? Outsourced that. There we go. It's outsourced that to an institution, and it feels like that's the part that needs to be reclaimed, is the part of the narrative that gets us to honor and respect the internal experience, while at the same time seeking to advance an understanding or whatever of the external world, something like that. And the integration, you used that word as well, right? But I think it was Lena used that word, having integrity, right? Being integrated, having integrity, having integrated the inner world with the outer experience. So I mean, this is all old stuff, but the interiority thing was what got me going around that circle again. It's a really good word.
Yeah, just to add a tag onto that, Eric, is that one of the distinction between Julian Huxley, that family is a really interesting. Julian Huxley was a founder of UNESCO, United Nations Education, Science, and Cultural Organization. That was one of his babies. He's the oldest grandson to Thomas Henry Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog, and who had coined in 1874, I think, coined the term agnosticism. Grandfather Huxley had taken on the Anglican Church with Darwin's new science, and so the war between science and religion, on the Western stage, kind of began to unfold from that point. So it's really interesting that if we say the 70s, 60 years later, that Julian critiques with the introduction to Teilhard's The Phenomenon of Man, critiques the entirety, right from out of the gate, the entirety of Teilhard's work, but he leaves out any mention of interiority. He counter suggests and imposes, rather than integration, a synthesis So as an imposition of a Western philosophy, that is not, it's very, very misleading and misguiding. So anyone that's picking up and to read Teilhard's, very notable work. So yeah, there's H.G. Wells in that mix too, who was had actually been a student of T.H. Huxley's, and H.G. Wells went on and later teamed with Julian and wrote a series of popular science books together, published a series of science books. One of the things that had always intrigued me about his publication of, I think it was titled the Grand Conspiracy or something. It was, he used the term ultimate conspiracy or something of that nature. And I've never been able to get a clear picture of what Wells was referring to. This kind of came up.
See, what was coming up for me is, I think it's Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell is the one who talks about the archetypes, right? And the in the narratives, and with the meta narrative, looking at the, I can think of what it's called, like the voice the story's in, when you have the omniscient narrator who doesn't affect the story, but they know everything that's going on in the interior and exterior of all of the characters, versus a first person story where you're authoring it yourself, but you don't know what anyone else is thinking and doing. And that part of like looking at the caricatures or archetypes of like narratives versus the Enneagram and the parallels that exist. But when you hold humanity to an archetype, it's like we're coming out of that storytelling phase of humanity where we no longer want the archetypal villain and the archetypal good guy. We want that depth to characters, even in no matter what the story is. And yet in reality, in the world, we are all the protagonist of our own story. Unlike every work of fiction where there is a protagonist or a group of protagonists and the antagonist, we are simultaneously side characters, protagonists, and antagonists in each other's stories. And we don't have a meta narrative for that. And so that idea of like dictators and authoritarians and how their childhood was, from what I know from Hitler's childhood and such, I don't know if any of them had idyllic childhoods where they were actually loved and cared for and seen of as individuals, but they also probably had a certain amount of narcissism they had to have, right? That certain amount of, the world ought to revolve around my worldview. I know what's good and I need to impose that on everyone else. And there's something in the fact that our stories are told from one person's point of view and one protagonist that gives us that in a way that honoring everybody gets to be a protagonist in their own story. And that means being an antagonist in somebody else's and allowing for that flow that comes up in life that doesn't, one person's story can't allow for that flow because it's told from one person's point of view. That was what was coming up for me. And just that difference of the narrator and the omniscient, that if you know everything, you don't get to control the story. You actually need to have a certain amount of, I know this and I don't know this, in order to play out the drama, the I can't remember what it's called, the arc of storytelling and such.
I love that the omniscient narrator has no part to play in the unfolding of the story itself. I love that. That's a really, really, the more you know, the less influence you actually have in how events unfold, kind of thing. I love that. It's not how it often works in the real world, right? But I love that. There was something else that came up that I wanted to say also, along the lines of, oh yeah, the part of the danger, I think, of being so reliant on stories to shape how we are in the world is that we get deceived by them, right? I mean, I'm thinking in particular of the hero narrative that you mentioned before, that Joseph Campbell's hero story, that our idea, because we like stories so much and we like drama so much, our idea of hero is the person who wins the grand conflict against the forces of evil, right? And it's a compelling story, but it misses the reality of what evil is and how to fight it in the world, right? Evil is a slow, we had this discussion before, Jubilee, but evil is a slow creep, right? Evil doesn't happen all at once. Evil happens little bit by little bit by little bit. You know, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist, right? That sort of thing, right? It's not the devil, it's just how things are. And that's how evil creeps in, because bit by bit by bit, it gets accepted as how things are. And so the real battle against evil is an endless, boring, mundane one, right? That's the real battle against evil. It's not the grand showdown. But stories lead us to believe that the grand showdown is how evil is defeated, and that's just not right.
Because that archetype of like, you're either a villain, and when you're a villain, you look a certain way and you act a certain way, or you're a hero and everything is reliant on you and there's a prophecy foretold. Versus, no, actually we're all villains and we're all heroes and we're all playing out our own story. And we don't even have a meta narrative for that, because even when you look at things like religion, when you're not religious, that is what they offer us, right? They offer us stories and ways to live if you don't take them too seriously. When you start taking them seriously, then you need everyone to believe, you know, that Hansel and Gretel actually happened. I won't use an actual religious story, but having that, like I said, I think we're waking up. Like, I look at what we're starting to do with movies, and you know, movies like The Joker and Cruella, where we're even looking at like the archetypal Disney and Marvel villains from what created them. How do we have sympathy for them and understand how they got to where they are? And I think the more we're actually able to do that, and a meditation is a big tool because it helps us leave like Jubilee's world, and Jubilee's the focus, and everything revolves around Jubilee, whether that's just I'm hungry and I need a meal, or what I get to live out in the world. And you start to see the connection that everyone else is both, you're part of their story, they're part of your story, and we need all of it.
The narcissism piece is really important as well. Just going back to what I was saying before, like the hero and the grand showdown, we like those stories because we'd all like to imagine ourselves being the hero that defeats evil in the grand showdown, right? And so it appeals directly to the worst of our narcissism. And I get back to, evil is not defeated like that. Evil is defeated in every moment of every day by just, you know, not going along with it.
It's also like when you're watching a story, and especially a TV show, and you're like, they can't die, they're one of the main characters. Or like if I'm watching it with my kid, she'll be like, is this for kids? I'm like, yeah. So then we know that the kids don't die, or the animals don't die, or if they die in the first 10 minutes. They don't die later on in the show.
Once you're attached to them.
Life doesn't work that way. Children die, your loved ones die, and it feels very affronting. Like, how dare you kill my grandmother off? I wasn't done with that storyline, right? Like she was central to my life. And there's that, like, the piece that plays out in stories of like, you can't kill that main character, you can't kill, and yet the reason they do it, right? The reason the dog dies, the reason the love interest dies, is to move the story along, is to create that drama. And yet we can't look at that like that in real life, right? Like, oh, my grandma died so that I could have this learning or this story. Like, she lived out her life. She had 98 years. She lived a full life. And yet at the same time, it feels, it touches on all of her kids, all of her grandkids, and everyone who ever met her. And there's I don't know what I'm getting at, but a flow to life that happens that doesn't happen in stories.
I was just wondering, is totalitarianism cyclical? And are we living in a time where we have to make the decisions you're talking about, Eric, more so that we're called upon? I mean, I feel now more so than ever in my life, that I have to make the sort of decisions that people would have made, behind the, in Poland 40 years ago. A lot of people in Poland at that time, their primary decision was just to keep their head down, I would imagine. And that's the decision an awful lot of people are making now, when it's a time to stand up, isn't it?
Yeah, I think to answer your original question, I think there is some degree of cyclic nature to totalitarianism. I do think it rises and falls, right? It's like war, right? You go for a period without war, people forget what the true horrors of war are all about, and this sows the seeds for the possibility of new war in the future, because people forget what a horror it actually is. You don't have the embodied lived experience of people around anymore who have been through it, and so for the same reason, I think totalitarianism is the same. All governments tend towards totalitarianism, right? And they reach the conditions become impossible. There's revolution, and back to a sort of measure of individuality again, something like that. But the inevitable. So yes, I think there is a cyclic dimension to it for sure. But that's not to say that the cycle can't be broken. Doing exactly what you said, right? People, when that tide is rising, right? When you're in that part of the cycle, people are aware of that and consciously don't go along with it and add energy to that cycle. Yeah, perhaps it can be disrupted. Really, again, really good question, Simon.
So it's now arguably even more significant than previous times in history, because I get the distinct impression that these people that have got a totalitarian mentality, with the acceleration of technology and AI and robotics, they're looking at a sort of, well, we know the phrase, was it, I've forgotten the phrase. Oh God, it was there a second ago. Beyond humanism, transhumanism, that's the,
yeah.
And they're trying to roll that out, and it's I don't want to get biblical about it, but there is like a sense of the final conflict going on here.
I mean, I'm aware of that narrative. I'm not certain to what degree I buy into it, but I'm aware of it. It's very seductive, though, isn't it, to be playing a role in the final showdown between good and evil, right? That decides the future of all humanity. This is a very, very seductive and sexy story. So, yeah, for that reason, I'm somewhat wary of being seduced by it.
Sure, but there are aspects of right now where.
So Eric, I'm kind of why you keep posing the premise of the final scenario. I'm having a little trouble. I'm not sure I'm buying into that. I also wanted to comment in response to Simon that this kind of my simple response is that in what he's saying is pointing to the significance of the learning experience and meaning making, that this is how crucial and important the meaning making process is with respect to informing our learning. What do we do in an evolutionary scenario? You know, how do we adapt? What do we do to adapt to, you know, to the externalities, to the actualities that are posing and presenting themselves to us?
Simon, you want to take that?
Not really. If it comes to mind, I'll say it. But I mean, just following on from my point, the significance of right now is that there's a sense that what is ever going on, it's global. For the first time ever, it's global. You know, even, I don't know, maybe I'm too conspiratorial, but there was a sense that historically there were puppet masters behind the scenes playing nations off against each other. But now those people have come up behind the curtains and they have a global agenda, whether they're in China or America or Canada or anywhere in Europe, Australia. It's a global totalitarian march that's going on.
Yeah.
Like, you know, people say, oh, I wish I could, I just want to get away, but where'd you go?
Yeah, yeah. Even
You become a billionaire and fly to space. It's the only option.
Is that where we are? It's the only option. In that case, I'm fucked because I can't make enough to live on, let alone a billion.
But I think that's absolutely like this is the first time that we are so interconnected globally, both that we're able to witness one another during a global catastrophe, during just global life. So whether it's unique or not, but there's also like, we are global. This is the first time we could see famine or a food crisis on a global scale, you know, water crisis on a global scale, you know, catastrophe after catastrophe in the environment on a global scale. And we're witnessing it. And it's like, well, how much is real? How much are we just witnessing it more because it's more drama, and drama means money, and they, you know, they want us to have fear. And how much is it actually? No, this is the hottest summer on record. We have way more wildfires, or more civil unrest, whatever the metric is that you're testing. And there does seem to be a fragility baked into our global society that we didn't have before, both our reliance on technology, if it goes down, and our I don't eat how many of my calories do I get local to here? So if the transportation system goes down or fertilizer stops being produced, how much food do we actually have? And we are fragile on a global scale, which we're seeing in like the conversations about labor and like how dare people not go back to work when they're on government assistance? I want to go to my restaurant, when it's like, okay, but is that really life sustaining? Like, is that really the biggest deal? If we don't have people in the factories who are making medical supplies, if we don't have people in the fields making food, that's important, but we could all do that. That's not, it's like, I don't want to do it, but someone ought to, so we should cut out those government money. And anyway, I think you're touching on something true, Simon, and how much is true versus how much is hype. It's one of the conversations.
So hard to know, isn't it? It's so hard to know, because like you said, there's so much money and influence and audience and admiration and so on to be gained by hyping up the hype, right? And using the hyperbolic language and showing all of the worst examples of everything in order to show everyone how terrible it all is. You know, it's pretty easy to paint a picture. It's pretty easy. But
the other thing,
but that said, sorry, but that said, I just wanted to say that I do very largely agree with Simon that the game used to be playing nation states off against each other, and now it's the whole thing, right? It's the whole kit and caboodle. It feels like the final act in a long running drama, like it's the final act now is unfolding and it's a last chance. I get it. I feel the same thing. All I was saying is I'm wary of being seduced. I'm wary of being drawn into such a seductive narrative just by virtue of the fact that it's so seductive. That's all I was saying. I'm wary for that reason.
Okay, so what would happen if a significant minority or even a majority believed that? What would happen then to totalitarianism going forward? Would it be over? Would that be the end of totalitarianism?
It's not, because of totalitarian has that attraction, has that appeal, and that's kind of what I'm saying is that we in Matt have learned very much from the history of the last 100 years. Because I'm not really, I think that the end game has always been about totalitarianism by definition is control over the totality. And it's always been basically universal. So it doesn't know its own limits. All we see is how it plays out, and how it's played out, with respect to history over the last 100 years.
There's also, although there have almost always been oligarchs as long as we've had money, I believe there's been people who amass a amount of it and therefore have a lot of power and influence. But for the first time in history, we, like with the tech billionaires specifically, just by amassing money and having that data and having that many customers, they are effectively becoming totalitarian. Like they are Pol Pot, they are Hitler, even though, but yet their banality in their evilness, right? That they can just go off to space, that they can like they have enough money to fix the world problems, and that our narrative collectively as a society is like they earned it, they deserve it. And so there's something different about amassing billions of money versus taking over a country and deciding that way how people should be run, versus, hey, you're just not on Facebook anymore. I'm allowed to, it's my business, right? Like, despite the fact it's interconnecting you with everyone in your life. And like this, it's the first time in history that a I mean, I don't know if it's the first time in history. It's the first time in history where technology plays this significant a role, where it didn't just like when there was first a railroad, you had to build the rail lines, and that is a lot of infrastructure, and the infrastructure isn't necessarily in the internet, it's in the people and the nodes and giving people those access to that. Like, we can't take over the railway, we actually can take over technology fairly easily, but our belief that they deserve to have the billions, and they created it, right? Bezos created Amazon, so we just either get to use it or not. It's like, well, actually we could create our own version of Amazon with enough people, and it wouldn't go to him and he wouldn't be going to space. But there's, anyway, it's like a spark of revolution. Like, we've never had more power as a populace, and we've never felt more powerless, and we've never had more totalitarian people out there trying to take control, witnessing it, and yet still feel powerless. Because where's that hero? Where's the prophecy? Where's the one that comes and dismantles the totalitarianism? All of it.
Waiting for Superman, they call that.
I don't know that waiting for Superman isn't an act of fatalism. Kind of what I notice from time to time is that people aren't even consciously aware that they have given up, and that the giving up is rationalized for them as a form of fatalism. They will say things like, it's always been this way, and the powerlessness is, you know, who am I to think that I'm going to, little old me is going to make things any different than the way that it is, and that scenario is playing out in mass, and because we have effectively, you know, we're standing in line to drink the Kool-Aid with respect to the conditioning of our own powerlessness. You know, the underlying question for me is, what do we do to begin to change and turn that around? I mentioned Roar Bajonas, and having just been introduced to his work. My birthday, I think, I mean,
Breaking up on us again,
but
Brian.
Jonas's work, I'm hoping in that regard, that respect. Yeah.
Did anyone see when Elon Musk was asked what kind of government is going to be on Mars? And he said it would have to be some kind of system where there was no real government, but just people doing things democratically. And he said also he thought it would be more important to have a voting system that you could vote laws to be cancelled and gotten rid of. He said it should be easier to get rid of laws and rules than it is to make them. or just put a termination point on them so they run out and have to be voted back on again. I thought it was quite clever. I thought, Elon Musk for world president, why not? That sounds good.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Statute of limitations on all laws, right? All laws, when they are passed, have a expiry date on them and have to be renewed at that expiry date if they're deemed to be still appropriate. That's a really good idea. It's a simple change. It's a really good idea.
I have a little bit of pushback on that. So when women got the right to vote, right, or people who weren't white property owners, that would be a law that got institutionalized, right? And so women getting the right to vote would need to be either expire or keep going. Well, then why aren't we also voting on men, right?
Well, no,
like there's a certain amount of like what was already there versus what was put in place. What's always been there also needs to expire. Yeah.
The women voting was not a question of making legislation in order to allow women to vote. It was about removing legislation that barred them from voting. So actually what this was, although there was no expiry date, that the legislation which barred women from voting was revoked, right? So it was actually a removal of legislation, not an adding of one.
And so that would probably be the distinction is
that
we would write laws differently so that they would expire. And therefore, yeah. And then when you first write that law that women can't vote and you know it's going to expire.
Yeah. I mean, that one's already been killed, right? That one's already been expired. But what it also does, it's just made me think of a really good point. What it also does is once you institute this thing, what you have to do is now go through the existing statute book and decide on, right, each and every one of these laws, what expiry date are we going to put on it, right? Laws which currently have no expiry date will have to have one assigned to them. It's really good. It's a really good idea.
So if we take as an example, okay, you take the Corona Act in the UK, which they're just about to vote to renew. They will very likely, the MPs will very likely vote to renew it for another 6 months or whatever. I think because of the control of the media and the indoctrination in the UK, don't know about the rest of the world, but certainly in the UK, I reckon if they put that to some sort of referendum, I think the vast majority of people in this country would vote to continue it.
Yeah.
So it's control of the media. You can change the voting system. You can give people far more right to vote. But if they're so indoctrinated that they can't think for themselves, going back to an earlier conversation. So it's the control of the narrative, isn't it? It's the control of the media and everything that we're taught from, the education from an early age. Going back to what somebody said the other week about giving a child up to the age of 7 or whatever, and I'll show you the man, all that stuff. It's the capacity for us to truly think for ourselves, which is under threat with the transhumanism thing and the calcification of the pineal gland, if you want to go there, and all that stuff going on, and all the additives in the food and all the glyphosates and the way we treat the crops and what we're eating, and all the opioids that are everywhere, the damage they've done, especially in North America. There's so much stuff that goes on behind the scenes that determines how we think and what we think. Until we get to the stage that we can open up a capacity for a person to grow into a whole person and think, I don't know, think what? Think sensibly? Think clearly? What is it we want to think?
I'm just going right back to the very beginning of the conversation and the analogy that Jubilee came up with of parenting as an example of authoritarianism. And I mean, above and beyond whatever what it does inculcate in the child, like almost from day one, is a deference to authority, right? Like they have to do what is demanded of them, do what they're told, and then they go to school and sit in rows and do what they're told and get punished for stepping out of line, and then they go to a job where the same thing they have to abide by, and they have a boss who's blah 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 blah. And so I mean, you're absolutely right, Simon, the ability for individuals to think for, but then how can you possibly think for yourself when from the minute you've exited the womb, you've been inculcated into obeying authority, right? I mean, I mean, that's poor. And so parenting, like in this meta narrative that is resilient to totalitarianism being able to take a hold, there has to be, both at the parenting level and at the schooling level, an active set of protocols to encourage exactly that, right? To break the conditioning of deferring to authority, which up until now we have been banging into, right? Obey authority, obey authority, obey authority. Now we're banging into don't obey authority, don't obey authority. You know what I mean? Like, you've got to somehow try and break that thing which you have inevitably created by virtue of, you know, good parenting of your children. You now have to continue that good parenting by breaking that thing which you have made.
It's all about it's balance, isn't it? It's yin and yang, because I mean, very often you get, you know, the hippie type parents that allows their child to express themselves, and all they end up with is a spoilt brat. So, you know, how do you get it right?
Jolly difficult.
Simon, that argument kind of depresses me, actually, because you can discuss all kinds of aspects and angles of fixing things, but at the end of the day, none of it really matters unless you can actually broadcast it to the world. And that whole brainwashing system is the real sort of primary target. And it always comes back to that as being the way to get the message out, ultimately to get everybody on board. And I can never really picture how are they actually going to do that. I mean, without some sort of miraculous kind of super hacker hacking every TV and computer and phone, or Superman actually coming along and flying through the sky, or how do you get that media? It might happen naturally through something, and at some point a disaster or something, but
there is a huge proliferation of alternative media
and a breakdown of the old gatekeeping media. Yeah,
but
for sure.
That's just part of the problem really.
It is at the moment.
That's the problem.
Yeah,
it's making it worse. It's not, I mean, if it was two of them, so the mainstream media and then somebody else who was telling the truth, but because it's a billion other people who are telling the truth, it's gonna just a lot more confusion.
I think that narrative that Simon just brought up, though, about that if we give them too much freedom, they become spoiled brats. And although there's some scientific evidence that like if you let your kids have no boundaries, they can do anything they want, and like they don't have to look at the externalities they have on anybody else, their siblings, the world, anything else, that absolutely plays out. And that's what our entire Western society is based on. But the kids that I know that are raised in more authoritarian homes versus more completely free homes, they absolutely have a taste of that spoiled bratness to them in childhood. They also seem to outgrow it in adolescence and adulthood watching, but it's like you have to almost have a faith that that's going to happen, because it's like they're allowed to have their full selves in childhood in a way that our generations weren't. And therefore it's like this, do I want my kid to eat healthy? Yes. But do I want her to listen to her own internal guidance that she eats when she's hungry and stops eating when she's not because I had to finish everything on my plate? Even more so. And this generation that's being raised, especially the girls, is more fuck you, I'll do what I want to. And it's hard to raise that generation, but it's good, I believe, going to be a blessing to society in the long run. And yet it means a bunch of like alpha, like every playground is fun. It's like if your child is the king, the queen, and it can do no wrong, they're going to come up against a bunch of other ones that are also like that, and they have to figure it out on the playground. And there's a certain amount of that almost has to be allowed. But I don't think, like, there's something that says, yes, there's a cost to what we're doing, and it's a cost we have to pay because of how much. There's a meme that was like, I want you to be obedient and compliant in childhood, but grow up to, you know, like fight the authority. And you can't have it both ways. You are the authority to your child. And so if they're not fighting against you, and it's harder to be a good, not authoritative, but still set boundary parent, it's a lot easier to either go completely free or completely authoritarian. It's hard to have that middle line, and yet it is very much, I think, where parenting has to go. But the only way to allow it is to allow it. You can't have state-run parenting in that way. It needs to be on an individual basis, which means we're going to get it all along that spectrum. And I feel like there was a point I started to make and never got to, but
I wanted to push back to Alan a bit on avoiding any semblance of magical thinking that something, a miracle, some sort of miracle is going to interpose itself with leadership coming out of nowhere that is somehow going to offer the guidance and the path for turning this all around. That there's just, it would be unprecedented at this point.
It just happened.
see,
Look, there's an alien spaceship just appeared on the screen.
I don't know. You got me, Alan. I mean, either we carry
I didn't make
on.
that. I didn't make that point as like that's the only answer. I made that point as if the only answer is that ridiculous, then that's why it's depressing.
Okay, I may misinterpret it. My stream is not good at all.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. You are a little juddery, Brian. But sometimes it's fine, sometimes it's but you are a little juddery. But yeah, I think the point Alan was making was that there's basically no way out. The only solution is a miracle, and therefore I'm really fucking depressed that the only solution is a miracle because we don't get miracles, right? I think it's kind of the point that he was making.
I mean, yes, the only thing out is a miracle, but it's not the Harry Potter's going to come, Superman's going to come, the prophecy foretold. It's like everyone waking up to they are the protagonist in their own story, and therefore there is no other to save them. It is all individual grassroots, create the life you want, create the community you want, and work to. I don't get to impose my values and my will on anybody else, even if it's better. And waking up to that, and therefore I will stand for your authenticity and your values as the highest value. That, like, I might not agree with what you say, but I will fight to the death your right to say it. That higher meta value is the value that most of us need to wake up to, not, well, the people in charge right now are really in alignment with my values, so yes, I want them to have supreme control. It's like there is no supreme control, and each of us waking up to like our anarchist individual autonomy and how to empower one another without having power over one another, growing out of childhood and into adolescence and through that like narcissistic phase is what humanity is doing, and it's uncomfortable and it's not a miracle. It's like there is a progress to it that you almost just have to not fuck up, and that is the miracle. And that was a lot in one, but yeah.
No, that's a really nice meta thing, right? That our highest goal is to enable others to achieve their goals, something like that. That is our highest goal. Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. It's very meta. That's really good. Sorry, Simon. I think you will perhaps say something.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think that the term anarchy came out last week, and then somebody shot it down as somehow being dangerous. But I'm a stand-up anarchist. I think the problem with anarchy is that the word has been corrupted. I mean, for me, at heart, anarchy just means do no harm. You know, I can do whatever I want as long as I don't hurt somebody else. And if we all live like that, then immediately you start to think, okay, if what is in my best interest cannot involve hurting anybody else, then by definition, we have to work together for everybody's mutual benefit. It's kind of simple, really.
It is simple and very complex, because right now we have two things in the zeitgeist that are very prevalent to right now, and they're very related, yet people tend to be on one side or the other, and that is the body autonomy of a medical procedure, the vaccine, and if you don't get it, you're affecting me, so we need this totalitarian, everyone gets it, we need passports, we need, and the Texas banning the 6-week heartbeat law, right, of like people being like, well, I hope you guys are okay having that tapeworm live in you because it's got a heartbeat, and like, it's like, how do you elevate a fetus to something that a tapeworm isn't, right? Without implying God and the Bible and marrying church and state. And how do you allow for full body autonomy when public health is on the line? And so it's like, not getting the shot, is that my anarchist right? Or is it, you know what I mean? Like, where is the do no harm in that? And that's where going more meta of like, even if it would be in everyone's best interest for everyone to get the shot, do we stand higher on body autonomy as an individual, or do we stand higher on, like, where is there is no common in common sense, right? Like, what is common to one person, and therefore body autonomy and the right of an individual in one instance isn't in the other one, because that one affects me. And even in the beginning of this conversation, when those things were going through my mind, that idea of both of those, an abortion and the vaccine, are both that individual entity, right? The idea that someone who is aborted could grow up and become the next solver of cancer, or Hitler, or, you know, like, they're a potential human. And COVID is a little bit like a gun in Russian roulette of like, it could take someone out, and who's it going to take out? And it's going to be a real human being with fully formed thoughts, opinions, family, that is going to be deeply missed. One's like a potential and one is an actual, and yet it's the potential. One is an actual, you're ending it. There is no, you don't get it. The other one's like a potential ending of it. And I feel like that went a little too meta and a little too something in it that I was trying to get to that maybe I didn't, but like, there's, people can't look at one neutrally and the other one neutrally. They can generally only be like, well, no, this one's a no-brainer, but of course I'm going to impose my will here, or vice versa. And watching this play out over the last few years, where people's values have kind of flipped, where they're now pro-choice where they were pro-life before, and vice versa, because it's you've just tweaked the scenario, is like what we need to do on a grand scale in education. Like, we need to think of things outside of the box and be not like, this is right or this is wrong, this is Roe v. Wade. Like, why? How do you write that bill so you're not giving tapeworms the ability to live? Because you can't write that law in that way unless you do arbitrary things like 46 chromosomes. Wait, then, you know, anyway, there's how do we do what you instated, Simon?
Well, I would say that it goes back to this aspect again of, you know, how do we think? It's all about informed consent. So how do we make an informed decision? It's not just a question of the information, it's our capacity to process it. And then we process the information, we make our own decision. And then if somebody comes along and says, no, this is the decision we've made over here, and you have to toe the line, then you can't make informed consent, can you? Because no matter what you decide, somebody else is going to impose their decision upon you. And that is for me, that is the beginning of totalitarianism, because where does it end?
It was very much when I was talking in the beginning about the tribes and parenthood, and how when they know you as an individual, I feel more comfortable, I'm still not comfortable, but more comfortable with them having that authoritarian role over my life in a way that a democracy I'm actually less and less comfortable with, because although I have a say in who is my prime minister or who's my, you know, on the city council of my city, they don't know me. I'm only a number to them. I'm only a public health number. And there's things that you do on a public health level that you're never going to do when you know someone, because you know their medical history, you know their informed consent. It's much, they're not looking at me as an individual. They're looking at me as one of the masses. And that is the only way democracy can play out on the large scale. And it's the one, I'm not comfortable with anything having authority over me unless it knows me as an entity. And no one can know me as an entity. I barely know me as an entity. So I'm the only one who can be in control of me.
Yeah, this feeds back into this idea of humanity, right? That in a nation of 60 million people or whatever, a centralized government with the best will in the world, however much they might want to, can't possibly be in contact with the individual needs of every one of those 60 million people, right? And it used to be, at least in the UK, it used to be that there were reasonably effective tiers of governance that existed in between the individual and the Westminster Parliament, right? There was a parish council and a local council and a city council and a borough council, and all of these things had their responsibilities. And at the borough council level, at the parish council level, you've got actually not all that many people who are being administered by this other body, right? And so there's like all levels of resolution are actually accounted for in that. Whereas now, over the last 20, 30, 40 years, since the 80s, really, there's been this grand shift of centralization, right, where more and more and more responsibility has been taken by central government and less and less and less has been trusted to local levels of government, more and more funding from central government, etc., etc., etc. And so there has been a greater and greater disconnect between Mrs. Jones at number 83 and the central government at Westminster. She used to have recourse, you know what I mean, at several levels before you got to that. Now there's nothing effective in between her and that. And again, this is how totalitarianism comes about, right, where the individual is powerless to effect change even within the sphere of their own lives, right? Because everything is controlled by this centralized body over which with which they have no direct contact, right, and no hope of really influencing. So yeah, reclaiming not just the interiority of the individual, but the interiority of the community, of the neighborhood, of the city. You know what I mean? Like all of these units need to be coherent entities in their own right, relating to each other across scales. Somehow or other, we've got to figure this shit out, not have it all run from one central conglomerate, right? That clearly is not the way. That way totalitarianism inevitably lies.
At the same time, Eric, recognize and acknowledge the complexity that to deal with those interiorities at scale entails ever increasing complexity. And this is something that, quite frankly, the masses are inadequate. They are inadequately prepared, quite frankly, to do that work. This is why David Sloan Wilson, with respect to pro-social and the pro-social model, understands that, and that the work has to really begin at manageable, doable scale. That's a smaller scale, smaller groups, and kind of continue to increase that sphere of influence would be an old term for it, but that, you have a core, and even then there are no guarantees that the principles comprising your core, that can be difficult work. But I think in terms of what we know and understand, or think we know and understand at this point, we need to get out of the mode of speculating and actually move into.
You went on mute there. You were mid-sentence. I don't know if you were done talking, Brian, but no, I think you're frozen. And one of the things, I don't know, the Jasper in the Game B space had written an article on this method of governance of, like, you meet with 6 other people. So there are groups of 7. And out of that 7, you elect one person to represent that group, who then goes on to the higher level of a board of 7, and so on and so forth. It would end up being a hell of a lot of meetings that everyone's part of, but your part, like, only if you're elected onto that next council do you go and become part of that. And so even at the top level, you would have, I think it's 10 different meetings that you have from your individual group that you meet with up until the highest level of 7. And there's a totalitarianism in that, of like, well, we're having a conversation. If I was elected or Eric was elected, to go on to that next one, we would talk, even though we were both part of this conversation and we both might have full intention to steward this space and bring the concerns of this group to that level, because that's, I'm assuming, who we would vote for, we would bring slightly different flavors to it and slightly different things that would be the biggest impact on our lives and the biggest impact to the most people that are there, which would then, you know what I mean? So there's a totalitarianism even in that level of democracy, of like, the majority rules, or the most squeaky wheel gets the grease, where if you have a lot of mundane problems is never reaching the top, whereas if you have a like huge problem, it might get up there. And but we can deal with them more things at a local level, right? I can't afford food might be something that 6 people can help me with in a way that 7 billion can't.
Yeah, that's a really good way of framing it. I don't have enough food. That's something my neighbors can help me with, but the whole world, what the fuck do they care? Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I really like that. Lena, you jumped on screen before. Did you have something?
Yeah, good timing. Yeah, a thought came in. I've just been listening because, yeah, it's just a lot. And that's what's beautiful is I was kind of connecting the conversations and the different topics that arose. And I'm noticing that, I don't know, I came up with the answer. No, just kidding. No, it was just thinking about going from parenting, the micro to the macro, and how it takes, I mean, to be totalitarianism, it's going to take all of these ideas implemented, micro and parenting, family, and how those family structures need to be strong, and then schooling, and it's just such a complicated narrative. But what I think the power, just simply the power of the meta narrative and having a bigger picture, is that can kind of create kind of this overlying structure, right? And it can create kind of a building block to all the work, and create a vision and intention for the work. And that's what's beautiful to me about just this conversation too. I don't know, that's all that really arose. I'm in the middle of a move, so I'm just like super stressed. My brain isn't fully on, but yeah, that was it. And with that said, I just got a text. I actually have to run, but keep me updated on future meetups. It's gonna be like 3 weeks. I'm moving, so yeah, I don't know when I'll be able to come back, but keep me posted. Thanks.
All right, have a safe and as stress-free move as possible.
Yeah, have a nice move.
Yeah, so it's speaking of totalitarianism, really horrible neighbor, and I've kind of been displaced. So I'm thinking I should take care of that, get into a safe place again, and then come back and reintegrate. But thank you all.
Good to see you. See you next
Good
time.
to see you too. Yeah, definitely.
There's also a lot of problems that are better dealt with at the local level, like conflict resolution with a neighbor might be something to deal with at a local level, but also camaraderie of like hearing someone and somewhat taking their side on something is actually somewhat better done on a global level, right? If I can be there for you to vent about your neighbor in a way that I'm never going to meet them, so it doesn't matter, versus needing to repair that relationship. And both things are important, yet when we do them in the same space, we can hurt the relationship with the neighbor in a way we don't, like Eric venting about his neighbor is going to have no impact on my relationship with this neighbor because I don't have a relationship with this neighbor. And like a marriage, if you need to vent about your spouse and then later on you're at dinner with the person you vented about them with, right? Like there's a different energy that we can help. I think it's important to be part of global community and people that aren't intermeshed in our lives and physical in-person community that we are eating with, living with, raising kids with.
Well, if no one's got anything else, that feels like a decent spot to call it a day. That's, yeah.